Good evening, welcome. And for this Sunday, we are preparing for the divine service for the departed. And we have a word from the Gospel of Mark. And our divine service is entitled The Gift of Life. And our Bible word is Mark 5 verses 41 to 42. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kumi, which is translated, Little girl, I say to you, arise. Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement. So those words, great amazement, that is something quite important for the author of Gospel of Mark, because for the author, he presents Jesus as coming into Galilee, and he performs all these marvelous deeds, and people are awestruck, and their jaws drop, and they look at this incredible man doing all these deeds of power, and they are amazed, and they ask, who is this? Who is this guy? Look at what he's doing. Look at his power. Look at his authority. Who's this man? It's incredible what he's doing. So this sense of wonder and amazement at the person of Jesus and his power and authority to do miracles, etc. That's something that the Gospel of Mark emphasizes as Jesus traveled in and around Galilee. So the Gospel of Mark, according to early church sources, it was written by Mark, and in the New Testament there's a John Mark that's identified in the book of Acts. He's associated with Paul. He traveled with Paul on some journeys. He's also associated with Peter. If you read 1 Peter, there's also a Mark that is greeted. But who this Mark is, the actual author of the gospel, we're not so sure today. And also according to the early church, Mark wrote the gospel in Rome. And he was an interpreter or a translator for Peter. But again, if this is really this Mark, we're not so sure. Other scholars say this gospel was written for Christians in Galilee, not in Rome. So we're not so sure when or by whom this gospel was written, although we call it the Gospel of Mark. And also the early church identifies the author as Mark, and travel companion of Peter and Paul, etc. Also the dating, most scholars today would date the Gospel of Mark to somewhere between 66 to 70 AD. This was a time when the Jews were in war against the Romans. Remember, the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. So this was more or less when this Gospel of Mark was written. And now the author, like I said, he brings emphasis to Jesus being this amazing person. I mean, he hits Galilee like a hurricane, but not a destructive hurricane, but he's a force. He's a powerful force. And he works his way through Galilee, and he does amazing things, and people stand amazed at him, and also his authority. And in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is also, he's called teacher. Like in our textual unit, we also see that. But the emphasis in the Gospel of Mark, what is more related or told by the author, is the deeds of Jesus. Like his deeds, his miracles that he's performed. And also his confrontation with the Jewish leaders. So we do not find so much teaching in the Gospel of Mark. In chapter 3, for example, we find many parables. But teaching of Jesus as such, it's more prominent in Matthew, Luke, also in the Gospel of John. So in the Gospel of Mark, the author tells us more or writes more about the deeds of Jesus, his deeds of power that he performs. Of course, Jesus is active in Galilee, and only towards the end of his ministry, he travels to Jerusalem. And also it's quite clear that this gospel was mainly or predominantly written, if not exclusively written, for a Gentile audience. Because the author also had to describe Jewish customs like washing of hands, etc. But also interestingly, it's this gospel where we find the Aramaic words of Jesus recorded. And that's why some scholars say this was also written in Galilee, because it brings us closer to the Aramaic, the spoken language of Jesus and his first disciples. Another thing that we can also look at in this gospel is something called sandwiching. Now, sandwiching refers to a literary device that the author of the gospel used. And let's look at one example. For example, if we go to chapter 11, there from verses 12 to 25, there we have, if you look at the top layer, there we have Jesus cursing a fig tree. And that's recorded in verses 12 to 14. Jesus comes to the fig tree, it does not have any fruit, and he curses it. And then after that, Jesus goes to the temple and he cleanses the temple in verses 15 to 19. And then after that, verses 20 to 25, they return to the fig tree, and Jesus and his disciples recognize this tree that Jesus cursed has withered away. It has died. Now this sandwich, or the sandwiching, it tells us that those two events that are treated in this way, they must be interpreted together. They mutually illuminate each other. And here in chapter 11, it's about symbolic judgment against the temple and the temple leadership that comes into play. That's the crux of these two stories, of the fig tree and Jesus cleansing the temple and also judging the temple leadership. And we find a similar sandwiching effect in our text word for this Sunday, because Jesus, this ruler of the synagogue, he comes to Jesus and he falls at Jesus' feet, says, "Please help me, my daughter is dying." And then the story is, let's say, interrupted by this woman with a flow of blood, and Jesus heals her. And then there's a return to the story of Jairus, this ruler of the synagogue, where his daughter is healed. So again, these two stories, they must be seen together. They reverberate together, or resonate together. So the one must be interpreted in light of the other. So what is going on here? Let's first look at our bigger textual unit, which is chapter 4, verses 35 to chapter 5, verses 43. And this is where Jesus defeats the forces of evil. We must understand, in the ancient world, people were not aware of medical conditions like we are. Like it's because of viruses, or there's some bodily dysfunction that's causing this disease. Back in the time of Jesus, it was believed that all forms of calamity, illness, death, etc., had its roots in some or other demonic force, or spiritual or evil forces. So the Gospel of Mark here tells us that Jesus defeats evil forces. And we have 4 accounts of miracles, how Jesus defeats these evil forces. For example, Jesus subdues the sea. That's in 4 verses 35 to 41. The sea was also kind of seen as the darkness or the deep. It could also be this evil force. But Jesus rules over it. He calms the storm. Then Jesus also, he cast out demons, like the Gerasene demoniac, and this demon called Legion that Jesus exorcised. That's another defeat of evil. And now comes Jairus, and his daughter is close to death. So yet Jesus defeats death. And then also this woman with hemorrhage, this blood flow. And Jesus also defeats evil there. He removes this woman from her impurity, from the condition that she has. And eventually also he raises Jairus' daughter. So this whole unit is about Jesus defeating the forces of evil. Now let's come closer to our textual unit, where we go to 5 verses 21. And now that's the top layer of the sandwich. And it's now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, which probably refers to Jesus now traveled west over the Sea of Galilee, to the western shore, perhaps Capernaum. We're not sure, but he went west. So a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed and she will live. So it says, so Jesus went with him. So Jesus now travels with his ruler of the synagogue, Jairus. Now the story is interrupted. Now's the middle part of the sandwich. And Jesus a crowd thronged around him and they pressed on him. So there were dozens or few, I don't know how many, but many people were around him. And among them was this woman who had a flow of blood for many years. And it tells us doctors couldn't fix it. And she spent lots of money on the doctors, but it didn't get better, it got worse. But this woman said to herself, if I touch his garment, I will be healed. And that is what happened. And then Jesus, he could feel this power that went out of him. And he says, who touched me? And of course the disciples said to Jesus, there's many people here, they cramming you, etc. How can you say who touched me? There's many who touched you. But there was one specifically that Jesus could feel that power left him. Out of all of these people that touched him, there's this one woman with faith who came there. And by touching Jesus, she was healed. And this is Jesus' response to her. He said, if we go to verse 34, and he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. And now we come back to the bottom layer of the sandwich. Again, now this is Jairus and his daughter. And people came and said, while he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? So there's no point. He's dead. But now look, Jesus' response. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. So here again, this theme of faith that comes through. So Jesus travels with Peter, Simon Peter, James and John. He travels with his men to his house. They arrive there and there are mourners. They wail and cry and they make a noise. At this time, people hired mourners to come and cry and wail, etc. Also flute players. So they were already there. And now Jesus says, why are you here? You're making a noise. Get out. Leave. She's not dead. She's asleep. And of course, they make fun of Jesus. In actual fact, it says they laughed at him. So this is now a challenge to Jesus. What are you talking about? So now, of course, Jesus went into the room where this young girl was laying. And let's read our text word again. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kumi. That's the Aramaic that Jesus spoke, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. So again, the people are awestruck by this Jesus. Who is this man? How can he do this? It's incredible what he's doing. Look at his power. Look at his authority. And the sandwich that we also find here it's about faith in Jesus. He has the power and authority to defeat the forces of evil. And we can also participate in that by our faith in Jesus. So that is what this story of Jairus and the raising of his daughter, and also this woman healed from a flow of blood, tells us. That's how Mark has constructed it together. Faith in Jesus. Believe in Jesus. He has power. He is amazing. He has authority. He defeats the forces of evil. So that's also applicable for our Sunday, or services Sunday, divine service for the departed. God also defeats the forces of evil, death, etc. through Christ. Wishing you blessed preparation for the Sunday service until we see each other again.